You are listening to PastThink.com audiobook. Please like and subscribe, thank you. Chapter 98. Crimson Pearl's suffering spirit returns to the realm of separation. And the convalescent stone-in-waiting weeps at the scene of past affection. On his return from seeing his father, Bao Yu, as we have seen, regressed into a worse state of stupor and depression than ever. He was too lacking in energy to move, and could eat nothing, but fell straight into a heavy slumber. Once more the doctor was called, once more he took Bao Yu's pulses, and made out a prescription, which was administered to no effect. He could not even recognize the people around him. And yet, if helped into a sitting position, he could still pass for someone in normal health. Provided he was not called upon to do anything, there were no external symptoms to indicate how seriously ill he was. He continued like this for several days, to the increasing anxiety of the family, until the 9th day after the wedding, when according to tradition the newly married couple should visit the bride's family. If they did not go, Aunt Xue would be most offended. But if they went with Bao Yu in his present state, whatever were they to say? Knowing that his illness was caused by his attachment to Dai Yu, Grandmother Jia would have liked to make a clean breast of it and tell Aunt Xue. But she feared that this too might cause offense and ill feeling. It was also difficult for her to be of any comfort to Bao Chai, who was in a delicate position as a new member of the Jia family. Such comfort could only be rendered by a visit from the girl's mother, which would be difficult if they had already offended her by not celebrating the 9th day. It must be gone through with. Grandmother Jia imparted her views on the matter to Lady Wang and Shifeng. It is only Bao Yu's mind that has been temporarily affected. I don't think a little excursion would do him any harm. We must prepare 2 small sedan chairs, and send a maid to support him. They can go through the garden. Once the 9th day has been properly celebrated, we can ask Mrs. Xue to come over and comfort Bao Chai, while we do our utmost to restore Bao Yu to health. They will both benefit. Lady Wang agreed and immediately began making the necessary preparations. Bao Chai acquiesced in the charade out of a sense of conjugal duty, while Bao Yu in his moronic state was easily manipulated. Bao Chai now knew the full truth, and in her own mind blamed her mother for making a foolish decision. But now that things had gone this far she said nothing. Aunt Xue herself, when she witnessed Bao Yu's pitiful condition, began to regret having ever given her consent, and could only bring herself to play a perfunctory part in the proceedings. When they returned home, Bao Yu's condition seemed to grow worse. By the next day he could not even sit up in bed. This deterioration continued daily, until he could no longer swallow medicine or water. Aunt Xue was there, and she and the other ladies in their frantic despair scoured the city for eminent physicians, without finding one that could diagnose the illness. Finally they discovered, lodging in a broken-down temple outside the city, a down-and-out practitioner by the name of Bai Jian, who diagnosed it as a case of severe emotional shock, aggravated by a failure to dress in accordance with the seasons and by irregular eating habits, with consequent accumulation of choler and obstruction of the humors. In short, an internal disorder made worse by external factors. He made out a prescription in accordance with this diagnosis, which was administered that evening. At about 10 o'clock it began to take effect. Bao Yu began to show signs of consciousness and asked for water to drink. Grandmother Jia, Lady Wang and all the other ladies congregated round the sick bed felt that they could at last have a brief respite from their vigil, and Aunt Xue was invited to bring Bao Chai with her to Grandmother Jia's apartment to rest for a while. His brief access of clarity enabled Bao Yu to understand the gravity of his illness. When the others had gone and he was left alone with Aroma, he called her over to his side, and taking her by the hand said tearfully, "Please tell me how Cousin Chai came to be here. I remember father marrying me to Cousin Linear. Why has she been made to go? Why has Cousin Chai taken her place? She has no right to be here. I'd like to tell her so, but I don't want to offend her. How has Cousin Lin taken it? Is she very upset?" Aroma did not dare tell him the truth, but merely said, "Miss Lin is ill." "I must go and see her," insisted Bao Yu. He wanted to get up, but days of going without food and drink had so sapped his strength that he could no longer move, but could only weep bitterly and say, "I know I am going to die. There's something on my mind, something very important, that I want you to tell Granny for me. Cousin Lin and I are both ill. We are both dying. It will be too late to help us when we are dead, but if they prepare a room for us now, and if we are taken there before it is too late, we can at least be cared for together while we are still alive, and be laid out together when we die. Do this for me, for friendship's sake." Aroma found this plea at once disturbing, comical and moving. Bao Chai, who happened to be passing with Oriol, heard every word and took him to task straight away. "Instead of resting and trying to get well, you make yourself iller with all this gloomy talk. Grandmother has scarcely stopped worrying about you for a moment, and here you are causing more trouble for her. She is over 80 now and may not live to acquire a title because of your achievements, but at least, by leading a good life, you can repay her a little for all that she has suffered for your sake. And I hardly need mention the agonies mother has endured in bringing you up. You are the only son she has left. If you were to die, think how she would suffer. As for me, I am wretched enough as it is, you don't need to make a widow of me. 3 good reasons why even if you want to die, the powers above will not let you, and you will not be able to. After 4 or 5 days of proper rest and care, your illness will pass, your strength will be restored, and you will be yourself again." For a while Bao Yu could think of no reply to this homily. Finally he gave a silly laugh and said, "After not speaking to me for so long, here you are lecturing me. You are wasting your breath." Encouraged by this response to go a step further, Bao Chai said, "Let me tell you the plain truth, then. Some days ago, while you were unconscious, Cousin Lin passed away." With a sudden movement, Bao Yu sat up and cried out in horror. "It can't be true." "It is. Would I lie about such a thing? Grandmother and mother knew how fond you were of each other, and wouldn't tell you because they were afraid that if they did, you would die too." Bao Yu began howling unrestrainedly and slumped back in his bed. Suddenly all was pitch black before his eyes. He could not tell where he was and was beginning to feel very lost, when he thought he saw a man walking towards him and asked in a bewildered tone of voice, "Would you be so kind as to tell me where I am?" "This," replied the stranger, "is the road to the springs of the nether world. Your time is not yet come. What brings you here?" "I have just learned of the death of a friend and have come to find her. But I seem to have lost my way." "Who is this friend of yours?" "Lin Daiyu of Suqiao." The man gave a chilling smile. In life Lin Daiyu was no ordinary mortal, and in death she has become no ordinary shade. An ordinary mortal has 2 souls which coalesce at birth to vitalize the physical frame, and disperse at death to rejoin the cosmic flux. If you consider the impossibility of tracing even such ordinary human entities in the nether world, you will realize what a futile task it is to look for Lin Daiyu. You had better return at once." After standing for a moment lost in thought, Bao Yu asked again, "But if, as you say, death is a dispersion, how can there be such a place as the nether world?" "There is," replied the man with a superior smile, "and yet there is not such a place. It is a teaching, devised to warn mankind in its blind attachment to the idea of life and death. The supreme wrath is aroused by human folly in all forms, whether it be excessive ambition, premature death self-sought, or futile self-destruction through debauchery, and a life of overweening violence. Hell is the place where souls such as these are imprisoned and made to suffer countless torments in expiation of their sins. This search of yours for Lin Daiyu is a case of futile self-delusion. Daiyu has already returned to the land of illusion, and if you really want to find her you must cultivate your mind and strengthen your spiritual nature. Then one day you will see her again. But if you throw your life away, you will be guilty of premature death self-sought, and will be confined to hell. And then, although you may be allowed to see your parents, you will certainly never see Daiyu again." When he had finished speaking, the man took a stone from within his sleeve and threw it at Bao Yu's chest. The words he had spoken and the impact of the stone as it landed on his chest combined to give Bao Yu such a fright that he would have returned home at once if he had only known which way to turn. In his confusion he suddenly heard a voice and turning, saw the figures of Grandmother Jia, Lady Wang, Bao Chai, Aroma, and his other maids standing in a circle around him, weeping and calling his name. He was lying on his own bed. The red lamp was on the table. The moon was shining brilliantly through the window. He was back among the elegant comforts of his own home. A moment's reflection told him that what he had just experienced had been a dream. He was in a cold sweat. Though his mind felt strangely lucid, thinking only intensified his feeling of helpless desolation, and he uttered several profound sighs. Bao Chai had known of Dai Yu's death for several days. While Grandmother Jia had forbidden the maids to tell him for fear of further complicating his illness, she felt she knew better. Aware that it was Dai Yu who lay at the root of his illness, and that the loss of his jade was only a secondary factor, she took the opportunity of breaking the news of her death to him in this abrupt manner, hoping that by severing his attachment once and for all she would enable his sanity and health to be restored. Grandmother Jia, Lady Wang and company were not aware of her intentions, and at first reproached her for her lack of caution. But when they saw Bao Yu regain consciousness, they were all greatly relieved, and went at once to the library to ask Dr. Bai to come in and examine his patient again. The doctor carefully took his pulses. "How odd," he exclaimed. "His pulses are deep and still, his spirit calm, the oppression quite dispersed. Tomorrow he must take a regulative draught, which I shall prescribe, and he should make a prompt and complete recovery." The doctor left and the ladies all returned to their apartments in much improved spirits. Although at first Aroma greatly resented the way in which Bao Chai had broken the news, she did not dare say so. Oriole, on the other hand, reproved her mistress in private for having been, as she put it, too hasty. "What do you know about such things?" retorted Bao Chai. "Leave this to me. I take full responsibility." Bao Chai ignored the opinions and criticisms of those around her, and continued to keep a close watch on Bao Yu's progress, probing him judiciously, like an acupuncturist with a needle. A day or two later, he began to feel a slight improvement in himself, though his mental equilibrium was still easily disturbed by the least thought of Dai Yu. Aroma was constantly at his side, with such words of consolation as, "The master chose Miss Chai as your bride for her more dependable nature. He thought Miss Lin too difficult and temperamental for you, and besides there was always the fear that she would not live long. Then later her old ladyship thought you were not in a fit state to know what was best for you, and would only be upset, and make yourself iller if you knew the truth, so she made Snowgoose come over, to try and make things easier for you." This did nothing to lessen his grief, and he often wept inconsolably. But each time he thought of putting an end to his life, he remembered the words of the stranger in his dream, and then he thought of the distress his death would cause his mother and grandmother, and knew that he could not tear himself away from them. He also reflected that Dai Yu was dead, and that Bao Chai was a fine lady in her own right. There must after all have been some truth in the bond of gold and jade. This thought eased his mind a little. Bao Chai could see that things were improving, and herself felt calmer as a result. Every day she scrupulously performed her duties towards Grandmother Jia and Lady Wang, and when these were completed, did all she could to cure Bao Yu of his grief. He was still not able to sit up for long periods, but often when he saw her sitting by his bedside he would succumb to his old weakness for the fair sex. She tried to rally him in an earnest manner, saying, "The important thing is to take care of your health. Now that we are married, we have a whole lifetime ahead of us." He was reluctant to listen to her advice. But since his grandmother, his mother, Aunt Xue, and all the others took it in turns to watch over him during the day, and since Bao Chai slept on her own in an adjoining room, and he was waited on at night by one or two maids of Grandmother Jia's, he found himself left with little choice but to rest and get well again. And as time went by and Bao Chai proved herself a gentle and devoted companion, he found that a small part of his love for Dai Yu began to transfer itself to her. But this belongs to a later part of our story. Let us return to the wedding day. Daiyu, it will be remembered, had lost consciousness while it was still light, and was holding on to life by the slenderest thread. Her weak breathing and precarious heartbeat caused Li Wan and Nightingale to weep in despair. By evening, however, she seemed easier again. She feebly opened her eyes, and seemed to be asking for water or medicine. Snowgoose had already left, and only Li Wan and Nightingale were at her bedside. Nightingale brought her a little cup of pear juice blended with a decoction of longans, and with a small silver spoon fed her 2 or 3 spoonfuls of it. Daiyu closed her eyes and rested for a while. Consciousness would flicker momentarily within her, then fade away again. Li Wan recognized this peaceful state as the last transient revival of the dying, but thinking that the end would not come for a few hours, she returned briefly to Sweet Rice Village to see to her own affairs. Daiyu opened her eyes again. Seeing no one in the room but Nightingale, and her old wet nurse, and a few other junior maids, she clutched Nightingale's hand and said with a great effort, "I am finished. After the years you have spent seeing to my every need, I had hoped the two of us could always be together. But now..." She broke off, panting for breath, closed her eyes and lay still, gripping Nightingale's hand tightly. Nightingale did not dare to move. She had thought that Daiyu seemed so much better, had even hoped she might pull through after all, but these words sent a chill down her spine. After a long pause, Daiyu spoke again. "Sister Nightingale, I have no family of my own here. My body is pure, promise me you'll ask them to bury me at home." She closed her eyes again, and was silent. Her grip tightened still further around Nightingale's hand, and she was seized with another paroxysm of breathlessness. When she could breathe again, her outward breaths became longer, her inward breaths shorter and more feeble. They quickened at a rate that caused Nightingale great alarm, and she sent at once for Li Wan. Tanchun happened to arrive at that very moment. Nightingale said to her in an urgent whisper, "Miss, come and look at Miss Lin." As she spoke, her tears fell like drops of rain. Tanchun came over and felt Daiyu's hand. It was already cold, and her eyes were glazed and lifeless. Tanchun and Nightingale wept as they gave orders for water to be brought, and for Daiyu to be washed. Now Li Wan came hurrying in. She, Tanchun and Nightingale looked at each other, but were too shocked to say a word. They began wiping Daiyu's face with a flannel, when suddenly she cried out in a loud voice. "Bao Yu! Bao Yu! How could you?" Her whole body broke into a cold sweat, and she could say no more. They tried to calm her down and support her. She sweated more and more profusely, and her body became colder by degrees. Tanchun and Li Wan told the maids to put up her hair and dress her in her grave clothes, and to be quick about it. Her eyes rolled upwards. Alas! Her fragrant soul disperses, wafted on the breeze. Her sorrows now a dream, drifting into the night. The moment Daiyu breathed her last was the very moment that Bao Yu took Bao Chai to be his wife. Nightingale and Daiyu's other maids began to wail and lament. Li Wan and Tanchun recalled all their past affection for her, a memory made the more poignant by the lonely circumstances of her death, and they too shed many bitter and heartfelt tears. The wedding chamber was a long way off, and the guests heard nothing of the weeping, but from the Naiad's house, in a brief interval of silence between their lamentations, they heard a faint snatch of music in the distance. They strained their ears to catch it, but it was gone. Tanchun and Li Wan went out into the garden to listen again, but all they could hear was the rustling of the bamboos in the wind. The moonlight cast a wavering shadow on the wall. It was an eerie, desolate night. Presently they sent for Steward Lin's wife, and had Daiyu properly laid out. Maids were set to watch the body. Early next morning they reported her death to Shi Feng, who was now placed in an acute dilemma. Grandmother Jia and Lady Wang were both extremely busy and distraught. Jiajing was about to leave Bao Yu in a worse stupor than ever. If she broke the bad news to them now, she was afraid for Grandmother Jia's and Lady Wang's health. They were already burdened with so many worries, and might not be equal to the shock. She decided to go to the garden herself. When she arrived at the Naiad's house and went inside, she could not help but weep. She spoke to Li Wan and Tan Chun, and learned that all the correct preparations had been made for the laying out. "Good," she said, resuming her brisk tone of voice. "But I wish you had told me earlier. I have been so worried." "How could we?" they replied. "Sir Jing was just leaving." "Perhaps it was considerate of you," said Shi Feng, on reflection. "Well, I must go back and see to the other half of this lovesick pair. I really do not know what to do for the best. I ought to tell them today. But if I do, I am afraid it may be too much for grandmother." "You do what you think best," said Li Wan. Shi Feng nodded and hurried back. She arrived to find the doctor with Bao Yu. Hearing him say that Bao Yu's condition was nothing to worry about, and seeing that Grandmother Jia and Lady Wang were calmer as a consequence, she decided to tell them without further delay. She broke it to them as gently as possible, in a place where there was no chance of Bao Yu overhearing. The news had a shattering effect, and Grandmother Jia broke down in tears. "I am to blame. I have brought this on her. But why did she have to be so obstinate and foolish? She wanted to go to the garden to mourn, but was torn between that and her concern for Bao Yu. Lady Wang and the others all tried to dissuade her, containing their own grief as best they could, and saying, 'You shouldn't go, mother. You must take care of yourself.' Grandmother Jia submitted to their counsel, and had to content herself with sending Lady Wang in her place. 'Give her spirit this message from me. Tell her, it is not because I am hard-hearted that I have not come to bid you farewell, but because my grandson needs me here. You are my daughter's child, I know. But Bao Yu is a Jia, and I cannot leave him now. If I did and he were to die, how would I ever be able to look his father in the face again?' The old lady broke down again. Lady Wang tried to console her. 'We all know how much you loved Miss Lin, mother. But the fates have decreed her an early death. She is dead now, and there is nothing more we can do for her, except give her the best possible funeral. That at least will be some expression of our love for her, and will bring some peace to her departed spirit, and that of her dear mother.' These words brought a fresh, and still more heartbroken outburst of tears from Grandmother Jia. Shi Feng was worried that she might damage her health through excessive grief, and decided to take advantage of Bao Yu's clouded state of mind to create a distraction. She gave secret instructions to one of the maids, who left the room. Shortly afterwards another maid came in with the timely news that Bao Yu was demanding to see his grandmother. Grandmother Jia stopped crying at once and asked, 'Gracious, is anything the matter?' Shi Feng smiled coaxingly. 'Of course not, Granny. He is probably just missing you.' Grandmother Jia immediately put a hand on Pearl's shoulder and set off, accompanied by Shi Feng. They were halfway to Bao Yu's apartment when they met Lady Wang returning from the Naiad's house. She gave a minute account of her mission, which Grandmother Jia found most moving. But she was intent upon visiting Bao Yu, and had to check her tears and contain her grief. 'Since you have been there and all is in order, I shall not go myself, but leave it all to you. It would grieve me too much to see her. I shall rely on you to do things properly.' Lady Wang and Shi Feng replied that she was quite right to do so, and left her to continue on her way to Bao Yu. When she saw him, she asked, 'What did you want me for?' He smiled wanly and said, 'Yesterday evening I saw Cousin Lin, and she told me she was going back to the south. I have been thinking that there is no one here to persuade her to stay, except you, Granny. Will you, for my sake?' 'Of course I will,' replied Grandmother Jia. 'Don't worry.' Aroma helped Bao Yu to lie down again, and Grandmother Jia went into Bao Chai's room. This was before Bao Chai had celebrated her 9th day, and she still felt rather shy in her new surroundings. When Grandmother Jia came in, she saw that the old lady's face was wet with tears. She served her with a cup of tea, after which Grandmother Jia asked her to be seated, which she did with great diffidence, sitting by her side on the edge of the couch and saying, 'I hear that Cousin Lin has been ill. I hope she is getting better now.' Tears began to stream from Grandmother Jia's eyes. My child. If I tell you, you must promise not to tell Bao Yu. It is all because of your cousin Lin that you have been made to suffer so. But now that you are Bao Yu's wife, I must tell you the truth. Your cousin Lin has been dead now for some time. She died just at the time you were married. This present illness of Bao Yu's is all because of her. The three of you were neighbors at one time in the garden, so I am sure you know what I mean. The color rose in Bao Chai's cheeks. She began to weep too, as she thought of her departed friend. Grandmother Jia talked with her a little longer, and then left. It was from this moment that Bao Chai began to rack her brains for a cure for Bao Yu. She still felt the need to be cautious, and it was only after the 9th day that she acquired the confidence to begin the course of treatment, which was to prove so efficacious. With Bao Yu's recovery, it became possible for everyone to talk to him more openly again. But although his health showed a marked daily improvement, nothing could abate his obsessive love for Dai Yu, and he began to insist on going over himself to weep by her corpse. Grandmother Jia forbade it, on the grounds that he was not yet fully cured, and any such excursion might upset him. But cooped up as he was in his room, his depression grew almost intolerable, and he began to suffer from his old fits again. It was finally the doctor who, in view of the psychological nature of the illness, positively recommended the excursion, to enhance the efficacy of his medicines and speed up the cure. Bao Yu, when he heard this, wanted to go to the Naiad's house at once. This time Grandmother Jia reluctantly gave her permission, and told them to bring a bamboo-carrying chair, and help him into it. She and Lady Wang led the way. When they arrived and saw Dai Yu's coffin, Grandmother Jia nearly wept herself into a fit, and was only kept from doing so by the repeated intervention of Shi Feng, and the others present. Lady Wang wept too. Li Wan then asked Grandmother Jia and Lady Wang to retire to the inner room, which they did, still weeping. As Bao Yu arrived, his thoughts went back to the days before Dai Yu had fallen ill, before things had taken this turn. The sight of the familiar room was too much for him, and he started howling wildly. How close they had once been. What a gulf death had put between them. His passionate display of grief began to concern them all. They were afraid it might be dangerous, coming so soon after his illness, and all tried to console him. He was already beside himself with weeping, however, and the most they could do was help him to lie down and rest. The others who had accompanied him, including Bao Chai, all wept most bitterly. Bao Yu, once he had sufficiently recovered, insisted on seeing Nightingale, and asking her what Dai Yu's last words had been. Nightingale had formed a most damning opinion of him, but seeing him now so overwhelmed with grief, she softened a little towards him. Besides, Grandmother Jia and Lady Wang were there, and she did not dare to be disrespectful towards him in their presence. So she gave him a full account of how her mistress had been taken ill again so suddenly, of how she had destroyed the handkerchiefs and poems, and of the few words she had uttered before her death. Bao Yu cried himself hoarse. Tan Chun now took the opportunity to mention that just before she died Dai Yu had asked for her coffin to be taken to the south. This set Grandmother Jia and Lady Wang weeping again. Luckily Shi Feng was at hand with more words of consolation, and she prevailed upon them to contain their grief. She then politely suggested that they should return to their apartments. Bao Yu could not bring himself to leave. It was only when Grandmother Jia insisted that he tore himself away and returned to his apartment. Grandmother Jia, because of her age and the state of permanent unrest that had prevailed in the household ever since the onset of Bao Yu's illness, was beginning to show signs of strain. This latest scene of grief and lamentation affected her so deeply that she felt a feverishness and faintness coming on, and for all her concern for Bao Yu she no longer felt equal to the situation, but was forced to retire to her room and sleep. Lady Wang was if anything even more inconsolably affected, and retired likewise, giving Sinclude instructions to help Aroma in looking after Bao Yu, and adding, "If he seems to be taking it badly again, come and tell me at once." Bao Chai knew how strong the attachment was that bound Bao Yu to Dai Yu, but rather than try to console him, she continued to take him to task in the same pointed manner as before. He, anxious not to cause her any offense, soon put an end to his weeping and tried to moderate his grief. He went to sleep, and the night passed uneventfully. Early next morning when they came to see how he was still weak and lacking in energy, but seemed to be over the worst. They tended him with renewed care, and gradually he began to recover his strength. Fortunately, Grandmother Jia did not fall sick. It was Lady Wang on whom the shock seemed to leave the most permanent mark. When Aunt Xue came over to visit the convalescent, she was pleasantly surprised to find him in much better spirits. She stayed for a few days. On one of these days, Grandmother Jia made a point of inviting her over for a talk. "We owe Bao Yu's life to you," she began. "He is out of danger now, I think. I only feel sorry for Bao Chai, after the way things have happened. Bao Yu has been convalescing for 100 days, and is really quite fit again, and now that the mourning period for her grace is over, we can think of celebrating the consummation. I should like you to choose a lucky day in the calendar for the occasion." "Your idea is an excellent one," returned Aunt Xue. "But why should you ask me? Bao Chai may not be a very clever girl, but she has a sensible nature, and understands these things. I think you must be familiar with her disposition. If the two of them can live in harmony together, it will be such a relief for you, such a comfort to my sister, and it will set my mind at ease too. You must choose the day. Will we be inviting relatives and friends to the celebrations?" "I think we should," replied Grandmother Jia. "After all, it is the most important event in their lives. There have been so many problems and complications, but now at last they all seem to have been resolved. I think we should send out invitations, and make a proper party of it. We will invite all our friends and relations. It will be a way of giving thanks, and besides, I feel that I deserve a bit of fun too, as a little reward for all the heartache this has caused me." Aunt Xue was very pleased. She went on to talk of her plans for preparing Bao Chai's trousseau. Grandmother Jia protested. "As this is all within the family, there is no need for you to go to such trouble. They already have all the furniture they need. By all means bring some of Bao Chai's favorite things. But please don't bother with anything else. Yes, Bao Chai is such a calm, understanding girl, not at all like my poor granddaughter, whose oversensitive nature was the cause of her death at such a tender age." Aunt Xue now began to cry too. Luckily Shifeng came in at this moment, and inquired with a smile. "Grandmother, Auntie, what is troubling you?" "We were talking about Miss Lin," answered Aunt Xue. "It is so sad." Shifeng smiled again. "You must not allow it to upset you. Listen to this, it's a joke I have just heard." Grandmother Jia wiped away her tears, and managed a feeble smile. "Who are you going to make fun of now? Come on, we are listening. If you don't make us laugh, we will not let you off lightly." Shifeng began gesturing with her hands, but was doubled up with laughter before she could get a word out. To learn what it was she had in mind to tell them, you must turn to the next volume.